eNCA Freedom Party leader Mangosuthu Buthelezi says his party can save the country from a lack of services and violent protests. Can it and will it? My guest today to discuss the IFP and its manifesto is Sibongile Nkomo, Secretary General of the IFP. After that discussion, we'll give you, as usual, our winner and loser of the week. But first, here's an issue. The EFF is seeking a court interdict against having to pay a deposit to the IEC when submitting its candidates list for the elections. EFF leader Julius Malema says the party will not pay the Electoral Commission of South Africa, or IEC as it's known, the 600,000 rand deposit required when submitting candidates lists for the upcoming national and provincial elections, saying there should be other methods used by parties to show their seriousness about elections. My guests to discuss this issue and others are eNCA political commentator Angelo Fick and Ralph Matshekga of Clear Content Research. Let me start with you, Angelo. Is this a publicity stunt, or is there a real constitutional issue to be considered here?
Well, this may very well be a publicity stunt by the EFF, but there is also substance to their particular petition. Given the large numbers of people who are in poverty in this country and in political movements that lie outside of the parliamentary opposition, it may be a significant moment in South Africa to begin to consider how political forces are represented and how much it costs.
Do you agree with that?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. Certainly, there is an issue of principle here where the question is whether the provision that parties have to pay 600,000 cannot be tested in court or not. I think it can be tested, and I think that rules and laws cannot be applied arbitrarily. It should be tested, and the IEC need to make a case as to what is the purpose of this and has to justify this before court. But we have another issue which we cannot turn an eye on, is whether is EFF being mischievous or not. I don't think that EFF as a political party, it is their responsibility to make a case for everyone. If they have a problem with paying that because they do not have money, they have to focus strictly on their own case and demonstrate to the court. If they need to be given exemption, to be exempted out of this, they have to provide justification. But the way in which they are going at it, the breadth of their argument, they are challenging the constitutionality of this, not specifically focusing on their own case. And I think this is where it shows that
are you saying that it looks like they have money because they can afford an advocate? I'm sure the charges there are anything from 25,000 to 80,000 rand a day.
Certainly, they do have money. They've staged a successful rally in Tembisa where they've managed to manage so many people. And I believe that there are certain fees that goes into payment for event management and organizing, and the banners for that. I believe that there is an issue of principle which the EFF is therefore stretching for their own mischievous political gain. I'll be satisfied if they come forth and say that we do not just want to challenge this thing constitutionally. We want to prove that ourselves as EFF, they should prove that they are having financial challenges. They are not narrowing it to that point. They are throwing a blanket case, trying to extract political mileage out of this.
But quite the opposite can also be argued, that if you can afford to pay it and you refuse to pay it, that is a principled opposition, rather than just the convenience of I can't pay, therefore I won't pay.
We do have to turn our constitutional principles to practicality. So let's agree that yes, you don't want to, as the EFF argues, you don't want to keep poor people, poor players out of the political game. How else can you do it? And I must say, in the EFF's case, I look at their new friends, the PAC, who they may or may not be merging with today. You know, this is a party that has consistently got less than 2%, less than 1% in the last election, and they've managed to pay it. But practically, what can one do? What can we, if indeed we don't want people to pay 600,000 rand to contest these elections, what practical measures can we put in place then?
Well, we live in a bureaucratic state where every citizen who can vote should have an ID document. Is it not possible to use ID numbers to register members and prove to the IEC that you have the requisite number of registered members of your party to be taken seriously? And that's separate from who votes for you. And I think that it is possible in a very bureaucratized state to prove membership by living citizens of your party as a measure of how serious you are as a political force.
practically over the next 2 months?
No, that is the difficulty, that if you leave these kinds of maneuvers until this point before an election, there are time constraints on the IEC that they can't change electoral law this close to an election without there being repercussions. And so in that respect, one has to ask what the purpose of such a challenge is at this point in time.
I have to ask you something. The defense, the IEC has put up a case saying, look at Australia, 16 million rand that parties have to pay, Canada, 8 million rand, Kenya, 580,000 rand, India, 1 million rand. Isn't this accepted international practice? Are we playing around here? Shouldn't we be following best international practice, Ralph Matshekga?
Well, you know, the figure of 600,000, it cannot just be thrown in arbitrarily. The fact that others are paying a high amount still does not provide the justification as to exactly what is it that the IEC seek to achieve. When I looked at their argument, I think they can still make a strong case. I don't think they are making a strong case in their response, the IEC. They are even going further and arguing that it is not up to the courts to decide as to how the IEC should organize election. This is the prerogative of the IEC. I think that anything else, any kind of law in this country can be tested against the Constitution. The figure cannot be arbitrary. They need to justify how do you reach that threshold of 600,000. What is the difference between 600,000 and 6 million? It just can't be the number of zeros. There has to be an objective to this provision.
Both of you, Angela Fick, you go first. What would you like to see as an equitable, just, constitutional way of resolving this kind of problem?
Well, as I pointed out before, in a highly bureaucratized state, there must be ways that aren't linked to financial means of proving membership of an organization. Every person in this country, in order to open a bank account, in order to get access to housing or any of the services, has to have an identity document of one sort or the other. And it is very easy for parties to use that system to prove that they have the membership.
What did you say, Ralph?
Well, you have an immediate case now about 2 months before elections, and I think to really to expedite this case, you need to look at the specific conditions of the EFF. They should actually prove that they do not have money before court, because courts are not there to just
resolve theoretical. Shouldn't they prove that they have members rather than prove that they don't have money?
Well, the idea of members, they can prove that they have members, but according to the rule, having members is not sufficient to be able to play a role. They should prove that, and then the other theoretical issues as to whether this figure is constitutional or not should be left for arbitration much later, even after elections.
Okay, gentlemen, President Jacob Zuma was booed by all reports that I've seen, was booed at the FNB Stadium last week. The City Press runs a story that the ANC in Gauteng is running scared that it may get, its polls are showing that it may get 45% of the vote. Is the ANC in Gauteng, does it have a Jacob Zuma problem? And do you put any credence to these sort of election surveys?
Well, there is a crisis of confidence for the ANC in Gauteng. I mean, consistently, they've been booed in Gauteng. What that means, the president has been booed in Gauteng. What that means is that the crowd is just not favorable to him as a leader in Gauteng. But I think that if you look at the polls... Is there a connection
between that and these survey reports?
The survey is quite drastic, it's quite dramatic, and it's quite consistent if you look at the mood in Gauteng. And the fact that Gauteng has got the higher circulation of the media, people have got much more access to information that it can be said about other areas. They are much more likely to change their voting patterns compared to other areas.
Angela Fick, do you agree?
Well, one would have to have some concerns about the reportage of those surveys. I mean, we are not told exactly, nobody's really identified by name, that there's much vagueness in the reportage. And so the ability to follow up on the value of the internal dynamics in the ANC is not open to any reader looking at that. The Markinor survey is a different story. And the fact that the two surveys seem to coincide on the number may be nothing more than coincidence, because one again has to ask, where were these surveys done? How representative are they? And then what does it mean to start throwing out these numbers in advance of an election? Because if you go to the province itself, it is quite diverse in terms of its demographics and in terms of its voter and its voter makeup, and what people declare to you in a survey they're going to do and what they do behind that little curtain when they make that X may be two very different things.
Very different or just a little bit different?
No, sometimes they're very different. That there are examples in history where people went in declaring they're going to do X and they came out having done Y, and the results were quite baffling to people observing it. And the US election that gave us the name for this phenomenon is one of those examples.
Angelo Fick, Ralph Matshekga, thanks so much for your time. After the break, IFP leader Sibongile Ngoma tells us what her party wants to do for you.
News that moves. eNCA.com.